Pretty cool, huh? I call it the Prince of Darkness look. Well, I started with a few tattoos, then I moved on to piercings, and after that I got into prosthetic implants. And it kinda grew from there. I told my doctor that I felt like a demon trapped inside the body of a human. He totally understood and said that years before he had decided to devote his career to helping people like me become their true selves. So I went for it. I thought, hey, why not? The tritium capsules for the eyes were crazy painful for the first month. Now I see a bright glow whenever I close my eyes, so it's hard to sleep sometimes, but it was worth it. All in all, I'm happy with how it turned out. Girls like it. I think they're into the bad boy vibe I give off now. Would I recommend this to anyone else? No. If this becomes a thing, then I wouldn't be special anymore, so no way. Well, I'm out of here.
I apologize in advance for the length of this video. Its length is due to an often seen asymmetry in communication. It generally takes at least 3 orders of magnitude more words to refute an assertion than it took to state it originally. Only Luke's Gospel has any mention of the census that required the trip to Bethlehem, and secular histories seem to contradict the Gospel account. While Luke's extreme accuracy as a historian elsewhere might lead some to give him the benefit of the doubt and consider him authoritative against all other sources, I chose another approach here. What follows is a novel explanation, and it seems the most plausible yet of the apologist arguments that attempt to defend the Bible's chronology with regard to the census of Quirinius. The Roman census mentioned in the Nativity account was a registration of people and assessment of all wealth and property they owned. It was in preparation for an eventual graduated income tax. Rome typically required a census of all of its territories every 14 years. The King James Version of the Bible erroneously refers to the census itself as a taxing. The New King James Version of the Bible, however, uses the correct term that appears in the Greek as registration. Most Bibles state something similar to the following. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. That was Luke chapter 2, verse 2. Most people will interpret this verse as an indication that Quirinius was governor of Syria when Mary and Joseph made their way to Bethlehem to register. The Bible also depicts King Herod as being alive for some time after the birth of Jesus, so skeptics see in conflict with the historical records of Herod's death in 4 BC and the decade later recorded date of 6 AD for the start of the governorship of Quirinius, and consequently wind up being convinced that the Bible is in error because of that 10-year gap and the contradiction in chronology. The New King James Version of the Bible and the Mount's Interlinear New Testament are 2 Bible translations that adhere to the original Greek for this passage. Fortunately, parsing this verse in those translations suggests a resolution to the apparent contradiction that is present in the other mistranslations. Since nearly all translations seem to have agreed upon the same error, one can only surmise that it is an example of groupthink by the Bible translators. Here is how the New King James Version renders the same verse. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. Superficially, the quotes are quite similar, But there are significant differences. When the verse states that this census first took place, doesn't that imply that the same census took place more than once? Otherwise, the unusual phrasing of this verse in the original Greek text and in the New King James Version English is nonsensical. Ancient Greek was a very precise and expressive language. If the author of Luke had wanted to state it the way that everyone translates it, he could have. As an explanation for why the same census might have had to be repeated, the fictionalized narrative of my book offers that some Jews may have cited supposedly imminent property transfers under the law of the Jewish Jubilee in order to confuse the issue of what property was owned by whom as a means to evade taxes during the prior census effort. That, together with possible incompetence by the individuals compiling the data, provides a rationale for a requirement for a redo of the earlier census. The notion of periodically returning all property to its original ancestral owners in the Jubilee also supplies a rationale for the unexplained and unusual requirement for individuals to be forced to report to a given city according to their ancestral lineage. Christian apologists have offered a 104 AD Roman census that occurred in Egypt as a proof that people having to return to their homes wasn't an unheard of thing. Therefore, they assert that the requirement that Joseph having to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem wasn't so unusual. However, Johnathan pointed out that the travel requirement in the Egyptian census wasn't to ensure that everyone went to some ancestral home, but only that workers who were away from home needed to return to their homes to be counted. While Johnathan was correct in making this distinction, he missed a tidbit that would have answered another objection he had to the Nativity account. Johnathan felt that even if there was a travel requirement, it was nonsensical for Joseph to drag his 9-month pregnant wife on a 70-mile trek in order to report for the census, when logically only he should have gone to Bethlehem. But concerning the Egyptian census, Gaius Vibius Maximus, the governor of Egypt, issued the following edict. Since the enrollment by households is approaching, it is necessary to command all who for any reason are out of their own district to return to their own home in order to perform the usual business of taxation. Clearly, the enrollment for the Egyptian census was to be by household. All members of a household must have been required to be present. The by household aspect of the requirement, though, was mentioned in such an offhand way in the edict that it must have been generally understood and customary. Now, if the Judean census required travel to a location that was determined by the ancestry of the head of household, it isn't too far-fetched for Mary to have had to accompany him, to have her nose counted as well, since she was a member of the same household. But the travel requirement of nativity account was a plausible authoritarian response to efforts to confuse the registration due to claimed ancestral property transfers. There may have been only a small percentage of Jews who claimed that Jubilee transfers of property would affect their taxes, but I'm sure that it wasn't zero, and there were some who attempted it. In response, though, the Romans may have said, "You want to jerk us around? Well, we can jerk back." The Jubilee rationale is admittedly conjecture, but it seems a doubly plausible one, since it provides an explanation for why an earlier census might be repeated and why the unusual requirement to travel to an ancestral city may have been imposed. But all agrees with the wording of the Greek text that mentions the census. We need an aside at this point. I should mention an objection that Johnathan MS Pearce often makes. He labels it in Latin possibiliter ergo probabiliter.
And again, this goes back to possibiliter ergo probabiliter. It's possible, therefore it's what happened. The whole possibiliter ergo probabiliter. And what they do is possibiliter ergo probabiliter. You're going to this possibiliter ergo probabiliter, and is the same possibiliter ergo probabiliter.
It's possible, therefore it's probable, which is a logical fallacy. When bringing this objection, Johnathan will focus on the hedging words that are used by apologists when proposing a solution to a difficulty. Explanations that include the words could, may, or might frequently trigger that objection from him. I would offer that a level of uncertainty is proper in the realm of conjecture, but that conjecture is also inevitable in human experience. We frequently encounter the unknown. Questions we might have about certain Bible issues or anything else we don't know are things that are unknown. It is best to admit to uncertainty, but frequently people do not. When the questions really matter, as in, why did my car cough and die on the highway just now, it is reasonable to have a working explanation, but we should keep an open mind and admit that it may be something else. Throughout that process, however, there is a confidence that there has to be a rational explanation. Everything that happens has a cause. Johnathan is correct, though. Abandoning uncertainty prematurely risks error in the case of diagnosing a failure of one's car. Throwing an inappropriate solution at the problem without careful examination beforehand may lead to a great deal of unnecessary expense. For Christians who are confident that their worldview is essentially correct, they are sure that any problem with the Bible would have to have a reasonable solution. They will often settle for the first plausible explanation they hear as the answer to a Bible difficulty, though. Yet historically, materialists often do the same. When asked to explain the origin of life or the DNA coding system for proteins, they will answer with great deal of confidence that the currently in vogue explanation is correct until it gets disproven and another explanation comes to the forefront. The words could, may, and might appear frequently, but the current theory always gains widespread acceptance to the point of certainty. I have asked materialists how those things came to be. They never doubted the current explanation, or they never questioned things enough to even know the theories. Through it all, though, their faith in materialism was unshakable. In a future video, I will point out instances where Johnathan himself fell prey to the same fallacy. Possibiliter ergo probabiliter thinking and the tendency to embrace error abounds everywhere. I therefore believe we are seeing a universal human trait and not just something that Christian apologists do. Now, back to the census. The second factoid to be gleaned from parsing the verse is that the Bible doesn't really state that the census was performed while Quirinius held the title of governor. Instead, the New King James and the Greek text, by the way, renders it as while Quirinius was governing Syria. We know from Roman history that Quirinius was officially appointed as legate of Syria in AD 6, but Quirinius had a long and illustrious career as a military leader and administrator. The evidence that contradicts Luke's mention of the census comes mainly from the historian Josephus. There is credible evidence that Josephus had his chronology wrong in this instance instead of Luke being in error. Check out the following paper by John H. Rhoades. The link for it is in the description. The title of the paper is Josephus Misdated the Census. It's an involved read, but the biggest takeaways for me were that Josephus seemed unaware that Quirinius and the Roman official called Sabinius were one and the same individual. Sabinius and Governor Verus took turns commanding the legions and administering the region. It appears that Augustus felt that Verus was less competent than Sabinius. Sabinius was the same rank as Verus, but he was left in charge during multiple trips to Rome that Verus was required to make. There also exists communications to Caesar Augustus where Verus and Sabinius jointly detail how much revenue Rome could expect from each of Herod's territories. That is indirect evidence of his census in Judea that involves Sabinius/Quirinius that occurred while Herod still lived. It is only the widespread anti-Bible bias that causes people to discount any historical claims that the Bible makes. In this matter, it may well be that it was Josephus instead of Luke who got his facts wrong. Augustus Caesar used Quirinius as a pinch hitter in various capacities from time to time. Years before Jesus' birth, Quirinius became the de facto administrator of a huge region that included Judea and Syria as a result of his alternately sharing responsibilities with Verus. This might mean that Quirinius was governing Syria when an earlier census was ordered, which is in total agreement with how the scripture is worded. If Rome was not satisfied with that entire census, or was perhaps only dissatisfied with the Judean portion, a subsequent redo of the same census in 3 or 4 BC, with no involvement by Quirinius but under Verus Quintilius, who was the unmentioned governor who ruled during Jesus' birth, makes sense. If Joseph was assigned to report to Bethlehem because he was descended from King David, then the rest of his family would have had to report also. But Mary and Joseph seem to have made the journey alone. My book explores a likely cause for the solo trip to Bethlehem. Additionally, other families in Nazareth who were not descended from David would have logically been required to report to other cities besides Bethlehem, which is also a reasonable notion. Therefore, the Roman edict would have supplied a list of report to cities for each person who needed to be registered. My book offers the list of cities that appears in the 2nd chapter of Ezra as the logical basis for such a list. It was a list of individuals and the head counts of those who were returning from Persian captivity and each of their assigned cities. Bethlehem was one of those cities on the list. The Bible is the primary source document for studying these events, but the belief that the Bible is a reliable historical record is what drove the process of conjecture throughout. Perhaps all this was common knowledge in Luke's day, and so he felt no need to elaborate beyond the brief explanation that he gave. The controversies over various details of the census did not seem to be a problem until the present day, which implies that things that were once well known are lost to us today. Certainty can't be offered here, but only plausibility, which purpose this explanation provides.